Great. So welcome everybody, and apologies for the slight delay. You can guess what's going on. We're doing today's a hybrid event. So we've got all of you lovely people in the room, and also nearly 100 people online as well. So hello to everybody online. Oh, there's the camera. Sorry. This is our first event that we've done as the Passivhaus Trust in 2 years, just over 2 years, and actually it's our first hybrid event. So please do bear with us. We have to try and work out how to make sure that everybody's included, both you guys in the room and the people online as well. And I've got Laura at the back. That's what I was just running to the back for, to check that everything's going okay. So we've got Beth and Chaley, who are looking after the people online. So Chaley's actually online, one of our team. And then Laura's going to be representing the people online, and she's going to be asking the questions on their behalf so that they can be involved as well. Anyway, so it's great to see everybody in the room, particularly who's made all the effort to come here. Isn't it a drag to travel to an event? You know, I'd kind of forgotten what it was like. You know, you click on a button and you're in the next meeting or in the next event, and now you've actually got to go somewhere and make an effort to do it. Anyway, but it's great because you also get to go to the pub afterwards. So there are some benefits of doing this. And it's what better way to timing to do our first event in 2 years than for our birthday. So you'll know, many of you here will know. In fact, actually, can I just do that? So how many people have been members of ours for longer than 2 years? Can you just put your hand up if you've been a member for longer than 2 years? Okay, in the room, we've got about half of the people who've been members for a long time. That's interesting. So our membership has doubled over the last 2 years during lockdown. We've got over 500 member companies now. So everybody who's new, online and in person, we're delighted to see you here. We do have a tradition of doing this kind of event. We normally do this kind of debate event in winter. This is normally our Christmas party. But we normally also have a summer gathering. So we've merged the two together this time, and we're doing a debate around net zero and retrofit, and we're also having our birthday party. So there will be some cakes for those people who are in the room only. And goodness me, this year has just been a bit mad. I don't know what you've all been like, but we have been so busy. It's been absolutely crazy. And I've just picked out a couple of highlights from what we've been doing. So these are 3 primers that we've released in this last 6 months on operational carbon, on retrofit, and on embodied carbon. I haven't mentioned all the research work that we're doing on specific detailing around steel frame, for example, the REBA plan of works and how Passivhaus fits within that. Thermal bypass, we've got specific technical papers on all of those things running at the minute. It's just kind of relentless at the moment. On our education side, we ran a whole series of masterclasses on retrofit in the first half of the year. We had 1,200 people attend those seminars. We've got a student competition running with Enmite and Tabitha and the Timber UK people. And we've got, to follow on from that, in the autumn, we'll be running large and complex buildings. So how does Passivhaus apply to large and complex buildings rather than the smaller scale things that many people start with? And then, of course, the UK Passivhaus Conference, which will hopefully return this autumn. That's also going to be a hybrid event. So this event actually here today is a bit of a practice. Because the conference, we normally get 400 or 500 people coming to. That's going to be hybrid as well. And actually, it's a bit of a bonus this year, in that the hybrid will allow us to hold the event outside the kind of core cities. So we're going to be going to Exeter for our conference this year. We're going to go and visit the St. Sidwell's Leisure Centre, the Passivhaus Leisure Centre. There's going to be site visits to that and training around that as well, on the site. But it's also going to be open to everybody online as well. So because we can do the hybrid thing, we think it's okay to go outside these very central locations of London and Birmingham and Leeds. So anyway, so that's a good thing. And there's lots more that I haven't mentioned on the education side as well. So we're working with REBA, for example, on building Passivhaus into all of their training for students. How would that work with all the architecture students across the country? We're looking at that at the minute. We're looking at how we build into NVQs, levels 4, 5, and 6, and how we get Passivhaus converted into that. And then detailed technical seminars throughout as well as all the kind of CEF people who are going through the training, which we sometimes forget until they come and meet us. More lovely people. And then on the policy side, no nice pretty pictures here. And again, I've just picked out a few things. We're involved in the Scottish Private Members Bill that's trying to get support for Passivhaus to be the standard in the building regs in Scotland. We held our first ever developers club for private sector developers, 10 private sector developers now doing private Passivhaus projects because they see an enhanced value, an enhanced sales value. First time in 10 years that we've seen that. It's the first time it's ever happened. Helping social housing clients with procurement, engagement with all local authorities. We had Sarah Edmonds from ACAN starts work with it yesterday. So she's going to help us on getting into all the local authorities in London, just to find out what they're doing on net zero and Passivhaus. And there's more, the National Retrofit Task Group, the Social Housing Decarbonisation Fund, there's a lot going on. So I don't know, I'm hoping everybody else is the same. I mean, I'm hoping that this is all feeding through into work and projects that people are seeing. Is that the general mood? Everyone busy? Anyone who's busy, put your hand up. Okay, that's about 3/4 of the audience in the room and everybody online as well. I saw them put their hands up too. So today, it's a bit of a light-hearted, but there is a serious message behind it as well, as always in our debates. We're going to look at where does Passivhaus sit in the net zero agenda. So the major shift of change has come from everybody declaring climate emergencies, net zero. And we're going to look at where Passivhaus fits within that. And I have a particular view, but that's not the point of today. The point is for us to debate it. We're going to look at new build first, and we've got 3 great speakers for new build, and then we've got to look at retrofit in the second part. The cakes come in the middle for the birthday part. And as always, we're going to get a range of views. So not all of the people who are speaking are Passivhaus people. So we've got people from the Active Building Centre, from Letty, and from other non-Passivhaus views. So you can take your own view. We will then give you some questions at the end and ask you to vote on that. And I think that's my last slide. But before I stop, I need to just say a quick thank you to, there is one more thing I need to say as well, to the sponsors. So the sponsors have paid for the venue and for the catering today. So they've helped us make this all possible. And actually, you can see from all the kit we've got at the back when you're doing a hybrid event, the amount of organisation and the team we've got involved, it's a lot more expensive to do a hybrid event. So without them, we couldn't do it. So I'm just going to name them and ask them to stand up one by one. So Aluproof. Have we got Jordan from Aluproof? Excellent. Thank you very much, guys. Nice to see you. Okay, ATMA and BCTA. Excellent. Thank you very much. Green Gauge, I guess that's Hannah. Hannah. Excellent. And Passivhaus Homes. We've got Passivhaus Homes, Jay Cottrell? Not here. Oh, no. Excellent. Well, let's give them a round of applause anyway. Great. So we've got some great speakers. We're going to start off, and actually we've got 2, this is the last thing I wanted to tell you. 2 of the speakers are online as well, because we're trying to make this as kind of hybrid and interactive for people online as well as we can. Sarah Lewis, she's joining us from the States, where it's about 45 degrees at the minute at 8 o'clock in the morning. And Andy Simmons is joining us from Hereford, where it's not quite so warm. So the first half, we're going to have Sarah Lewis from the Passivhaus Trust. I think most of you know her, the Research and Policy Director. Pragya Gupta from the Active Building Centre, who is building physicist or head of building physics at the Active Building Centre. And David Adams, and it says Future Homes Hub here. It shouldn't do. It should say independent consultant, but he does work with the Future Homes Hub. He's an advisor to them, and he'll be taking the stance of the kind of what the major house builders think of this net zero agenda. So apologies, David, it shouldn't say that, but independent consultant David Adams. Great. So I'm going to stop at that point, and we're going to hand over to Sarah as our first speaker. This is where I cross my fingers and hope it's all going to work.
Great. Well, hopefully you can all hear me, and hopefully this is all working. So hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to get to join you all today. This is my first time presenting at a hybrid event, so I'm just hoping that all the technology from my side works. Yeah, it's very exciting. Sad to be missing the cake at halftime, though. Although I guess it's breakfast time here, so maybe not so appropriate. David, could you go to my first slide? Perfect. Okay. So I've only got 10 minutes. I'm assuming John's going to be quite strict with me on this. So I'm going to get straight into it. The IPCC identified the CO2 pathway that we need to follow to get to net zero. And that's the red line on this graph. This line is already scarily steep. And every day we don't make impactful choices towards this reduction in CO2, the line just gets steeper. So we can't spend the next 10 years waiting around for technology solutions or consulting on policy. We need to act, and we need to act now. And just to be clear, for our sector to meet its part of this reduction, we're not talking about slow, gentle, incremental improvements in our building performance targets. Let's be real and agree this needs to be urgent, dramatic action. And it needs to happen not in 2050, not in 2030, not even in 2025, but it needs to happen today. Next slide, please. So how are we getting on with this steep downward trajectory that we need to be on? Well, if we look at the reality of this, this is the greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings. We can see, shockingly, there has been no discernible improvement over the last decade. Next slide. But surely it's not all bad news. Our governments, our devolved governments around the UK, keep making incremental improvements to our regulations. So our buildings are becoming more sustainable. Well, not necessarily. If you just click on, David. This graph neatly illustrates the futility of using the building regulation EPC rating as a measure of energy efficiency. A better score does not necessarily deliver that better efficiency that it implies. We need a better methodology to deliver the improvements that we must make. And I'm going to make the case today for that to be Passivhaus. Next slide. So this chart is showing the energy losses on the left through the building fabric and gains on the right through a typical house built in 2021. So you can see that even when we have the solar gains and the internal gains, so if you just do 2 clicks, David, and those will come up just to show everyone how small those are. So that's the solar gains and the internal gains. The heating system, which is that area in pink, has to do a huge amount of work to balance out all those fabric losses on the left. And let's not forget, we've got this very tricky performance gap to deal with as well. So if you could just click on, David, you'll see the performance gap shown there, which is actually 60% of the total. If you could just go back a slide. Okay. So and the kind of slow incremental improvements are not going to get us to where we need to be. So if you click to the next slide, the fundamental principle for Passivhaus is to reduce the heat losses so significantly that the building's heating demand can be largely met by the sun, the people, and the internal machinery in a building, with just a small contribution from the heating system. And of course, Passivhaus effectively eliminates the performance gap. And importantly, this standard is for today, but it's also for the future. The same energy metrics have been in use for more or less unchanged since the 1990s, such as the 15 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum limit for space heating. And this can be used to deliver to both the REBA 2030 challenge, and also it's the space heating limit recommendation in the LETI Climate Emergency Design Guide. So there's clear cross-industry backing for Passivhaus levels of performance, and a recognition that this is the level that we need to be at to get to net zero. Next slide. So Passivhaus is often assumed to be primarily an energy standard, as it does that kind of part so well. And whilst it's true, if you click on once, that Passivhaus delivers very low energy buildings, and click on, helps us to address the climate emergency, the standard also delivers much more. So I think it's like 4 clicks now, David. So benefits can be observed in terms of things like health and well-being, people performance, finance, as well as those broader societal effects. Next slide. So an argument you hear quite a lot is, well, that's all well and good, but Passivhaus and very low energy buildings are just too expensive. But when we look at the big picture and compare the cost of building more efficiently over the lifetime of a building, and here we've taken a 60-year lifespan, with the alternative of producing more energy, we can see that the cost at just 3 or 4 pence per kilowatt hour for building more efficiently is less than the cost of generating that kilowatt. So saving energy in every scenario is cheaper for all forms of renewable energy than that generation. Next slide. So So you should just be able to click once and it'll just fill in. So Passivhaus is this international tool. It's backed by 30 years of evidence. It provides us with a range of approaches to deliver new and existing buildings which are optimized for net zero. And this really is no time to reinvent the wheel. The tools we need to deliver on our climate pledges exist today. So we really must just get to work. The Passivhaus standard provides the solutions that we need in the UK to the hurdles that we have as a country of getting to net zero as a nation. And of course, Passivhaus is no longer this niche standard for small one-off projects. There are over 7,000 units currently under development around the country. And the images on this slide were just to give a flavour of some of the completed and projects underway around the country, including a range of building typologies from business centres and universities to swimming pools. Next slide. So John just showed you this, but if you want to see how Passivhaus can fit in with your net zero ambitions, we have this set of easy to digest primers covering, as John mentioned, Passivhaus and operational carbon, Passivhaus and embodied carbon, and Passivhaus and retrofit. Next slide. So for true zero carbon, we must account for all of the carbon emissions which are generated during a building's lifetime relating to its use, including how that operational energy is generated, stored, and delivered. So the pink bars here represent a typical house built last year. The shorter pink bar is what building regulations would say is a net zero building. And then the tall pink bar there in the middle is adding into this all the demands that a building regulations calculation does not consider, but which are there in reality, so have to be met. The blue bar is the Passivhaus. Now, Passivhaus is not prescriptive about how we meet this remaining load. But however we do that, whether this is with on-site renewables or at a more economic, larger scale off-site, which has the potential for a much lower life cycle cost and also lower embodied carbon, for example, than things like roof-mounted solar PV. Or even a combination of those two. What is clear is that the starting point, making that Passivhaus, a Passivhaus level of demand, will make our job of getting to net zero as a nation a whole lot easier. So efficiency has to be the starting point. When we think net zero, we need to first think efficiency. If you just click on, David. Thank you. So a Passivhaus will have significantly lower heating bills than a typical new build equivalent. And in all the discussions that we have as a sector around decarbonisation, it's really, really important that we do not lose sight of the huge number of people in the UK and homes that are living in fuel poverty and the impact that decarbonisation will have on those most vulnerable members of our society. So even before the current energy price crisis that we're seeing, over 4 million UK homes were living in fuel poverty. So it's absolutely critical that as we make this switch to decarbonised heating, we do it in a way that does not exacerbate this problem. And we do that by focusing on demand reduction and bill reduction as part of the solution. Next slide. So we've seen that Passivhaus prioritizes efficiency, but that is not just in terms of operational energy. This efficiency is also in material resources. So Passivhaus buildings are optimized for net zero, providing the very best route to minimize whole life carbon. And we've just been discussing how the outstanding levels of building performance minimize that operational carbon, but the Passivhaus design methodology is also found to encourage optimization of embodied carbon through efficient use of materials and radically reducing heating and cooling plant. So the graph here, it shows the benefit of a Passivhaus over 60 years. And in reality, our buildings are hopefully going to be lasting a lot longer than this. And then those Passivhaus operational carbon savings are getting delivered year on year. So the benefits of a Passivhaus just get better and better the longer the building is in use. You often hear queries around, what about the windows, for example, but our analysis shows that extra pane of glass is insignificant compared to much larger embodied carbon concerns around structure and services. Next slide. It's my second to last slide. So I'm not actually touching on retrofit. I'm not meant to be. It's in the second session, but it's so important to think holistically when it comes to our net zero future, not least to remind ourselves how important it is that our new buildings do not add to the future retrofit challenge, as this is already plenty big enough. If we build today to the minimum building regulations, we're just creating a new raft of buildings to retrofit at huge monetary costs to our clients and huge embodied carbon costs to the planet. This graph from our retrofit primer highlights the challenge For our whole built environment sector, not just retrofits, there's a limit to the peak load that can be met in the future. And it's estimated that this peak thermal load, which is currently demanded by our homes and delivered by gas, is up at 170 gigawatts. And the budget for 2050 from National Grid is down at that yellow dotted line at 30 gigawatts. So this puts into stark reality, brings into stark reality that when we're thinking about new buildings, we have to do the very, very best we can in terms of operational carbon. Passivhaus for new builds is absolutely the most appropriate standard, and anything less is at best a missed opportunity and at worst a gross negligence of our responsibility as citizens of a planet in the grip of climate collapse. So to get to net zero, we need to radically reduce energy demand and drive efficiency, which is what Passivhaus does. We cannot simply generate more zero carbon energy supply due to those limitations that we've just seen in the national grid, but in terms of overall grid capacity, but also this peak load issue, and then the demands for renewable energy from other sectors. Next and final slide. That's just a little arrow. You can go to the next slide and just click once. So I nearly didn't include this slide as it felt a little bit too sentimental, but then, hey, how could I not include it? This is why we design buildings, and this is what it means to people when we do it right. When buildings perform, when bills are low, and when there's spaces where people live and work and play, in fact, are healthy, safe, and really joyful to be in. And on that note, I'm going to allow these happy faces to close out my presentation. Thank you very much.
Great, so I can click my fingers now. So that was okay. That's the first online speaker. And we're going to go straight on. We're not going to take questions right now. We're going to then bring all the three speakers together for a panel. We've got 20 minutes for the panel at the end of this session. So if I could invite Pragya up next. Pragya Gupta from the Active Building Centre.
This is on. Could you hear me all right? Yeah. Oh, you cannot. Oh, it's better now. Thank you. Thank you, John, and thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. Could I have my slides up, please? So I'm going to talk about why do we need, what is the case for net zero buildings. Sarah has very nicely established that we need passive house buildings, but I'm here to talk about that each and every building that we are building now, they have to be net zero. We do not have any alternative. So I'm going to start off exactly why do we need net zero. We all know about the climate change and the global crisis that we are in. And we know in the United Kingdom, last few years have been really hot, and we know the sea levels are rising. And recently, last week itself, Climate Change Committee released their new report, which highlighted some significant gaps in our policies. And they have said we are at risk as a country in delivering our climate challenges and reaching our climate target. They've highlighted the emissions from the built environment in 2021 were about 20%, and the domestic sector was responsible for about 75% of those. And with the recent price hike, which was about 54%, Sarah mentioned before the price hike, it was 4 million homes in fuel poverty, but now that's 6 million approximately, which is a scary figure. So we cannot afford to not have net zero buildings and add more to the crisis. So who are we? As Active Building Centre, we were established in 2018 as part of UK government's Transforming Construction Challenge, and we are based out of Swansea, and we have our research labs in Berkeley. So what's an active building? You all are familiar with the energy hierarchy, which has 3 layers to it: reduce the demand, meet them with energy efficient technologies, and reuse renewables. But at Active Building Centre, we've added another layer to it, which is to integrate. So an active building is one which supports the energy network by not only being energy efficient, but also by integrating the renewable energy technologies and interacting with the grid, with your vehicles and everything. So I'm going to present some of our case studies on what an impact a net zero building can do on people and the climate. So one of the case studies here is Mali, which is a private home development in Cambridgeshire. As part of the development, it's 1,300 new homes, private homes, in collaboration with Hill Marshall and PTE Architects. As a planning condition, the council kept that you need to have 5 pilot homes as part of phase 1. An Active Building Centre was involved at REVA stage 2, where we supported the architects in establishing how they can approach Active Building Centre and include those principles in their building. And We supported with the feasibility study of the 5 active homes. We helped them in procurement of the different technologies needed to deliver an active home. And you can see an impact over here that what it does to us. So a standard build is one where you build it to the current Part L regulations. A baseline design is since because it has 1,300 homes, the rest of the homes have to be built to a certain standard, which is still better because Cambridge Council has their regulations and it is still better. But if you build it to active home standards, it is a 64% improvement on a standard build, which just goes on to, it's not net zero, but it's because when you're working with a big house builder, you have certain challenges which we are still struggling to collaborate on and deliver those buildings. But then there you can see another difference, which is the social housing, and you're working with the Flintshire County Council in Wales. And here we were involved from a very early stage, and we were able to do dynamic simulation modeling at REBA stage 2. And when the client came to us, they just had a concept plan. So the impact that we could make from an early stage was great, which shows in our results, even though it's still at planning stage. But it shows that if you are doing the right things from the beginning by reducing the demand, reducing the orientation, changing the orientation, and maximizing the PV generation on the roof, it can just get down to 124%, which highlights here. And another thing, because it's a whole social housing, there is no need for air source heat pumps because we followed the passive house approach. So these are going to be certified passive houses. The heating demand for the homes is nearly 5 to 7 days is when they really need to turn on the heating. So we did not need any air source heat pumps, and they're going to meet that with just infrared heating. And that shows on the operational carbon emissions, which is negative, better than net zero. That's what we hope they're going to be. We are going to take more detailed analysis on the later stages, but still at planning, we were able to do dynamic modeling. And the running cost is -100 because the users are able to share and do exchange with the grid. So that just shows and highlights that what an impact you can make on a building if at the right stage with the right design and the right approach. And this approach not only applies to domestic buildings. This is another example of a non-domestic building where we are applying the active building approach to industrial buildings, and it's in collaboration with Carmarthenshire Council and Welsh Government, where we are building 3 non-domestic industrial and office blocks. And the target here was achieving REBA 2030 climate challenge. And it has been a challenging project. I wouldn't say it wasn't, but we are getting there. The highlight for this project was, since this building is going to be monitored 5 years after it's been constructed, and the contractors are going to be held up accountable for what they've delivered. So that was the driving force behind it, because we can hold them accountable of what they have delivered. Concludingly, this is what we work on at Active Building Center. It's comfort, carbon, and cost. It's a balancing act which you cannot achieve. Like, to achieve one, you cannot compromise the other. So this example just shows on here the overheating analysis that we did for a non-active home. So the building was overheating and the maximum temperature was reaching about 40 degrees in summers. And that's what a standard UK Part L regulation build will do, because you're just supposed to comply with SAP calculations. And that just goes on to highlight that we are not doing enough at this stage. Even though with the new Part O overheating assessments, it still is just for non-domestic buildings that you need to do dynamic simulation modeling. You don't have to do any sort of dynamic modeling for residential buildings, and this is a residential building. So there's a very high risk of potential overheating in those homes when you have the future weather conditions, and you know that is not going to be, it's going to be there. You're going to have extreme weather conditions in the future, so we need to future-proof our buildings. And you can see the impact that we can have if you build. So this is the calculation done for a standard 3-bed home of 74 square meters of UK. And if you follow a non-active home approach, the Mali project approach, where we had challenges and we weren't able to maximize the roof generation, but in Conisky, where we were able to maximize the roof generation and meet the demand, there was 103% improvement on standard build. So just concluding on here, I would like to say that it's like we cannot afford to not build net zero. The 80% of the buildings that would be existing in 2050 are already built. And we know there are challenges on retrofitting those buildings. We cannot make each of those buildings net zero. So we cannot afford not to build net zero buildings at this point, and each and every building that we need to build has to be net zero. So the question here doesn't have to be why net zero, it has to be how do we support the construction industry in delivering those net zero buildings. All right, was I on time?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Great, thank you, Pragya. So we've heard about efficiency as the first renewable, and then we've heard about on-site, on-building renewables. And now we've got David Adams, who's going to tell us about what some of the major house builders are doing or hoping to do on this approach. So David.
Thank you, John. I guess you're probably sat there going, oh my goodness, what's a main house builder going to say after that? Fantastic presentations, really appreciated. This is my second hybrid event, and by the looks of it, the slides work. Just to be safe on this one, I thought I'd cut out the middleman and not have any slides, because I was told after my presentation last time, no one could see the slides, they'd all wiped out. So there are no slides, you've just got me. I'm kind of notionally talking from a Future Homes Hub perspective, more from my own personal perspective, but I am working with them. From my background, I used to work and set up the Zero Carbon Hub. I was keen to engage, but do not quote me as this is the house builder view if you'd like me to live. I'm also conscious that, you know, you guys, fantastic job. You know, you really are pushing the envelope, and you see me as a main house builder. And the main house builders see me as a green person pushing and so you both hate me. What was the Future Homes Hub set up for? I mean, you can read it on the web. The purpose is very much to facilitate collaboration beyond just homes, but very seriously to help meet the climate and environmental challenges. And at its heart, that is what it is aiming to do. Hey, look, we will judge them, I will judge them to see where it goes. But activities-wise, it's about developing those solutions as the reg changes, overcoming the barriers to implementation, and I'll touch on that later because they are significant. Importantly, to develop industry-led proposals, and we will see that's probably the biggest test for it actually, and certainly creating a basis for measuring sustainability from that huge level of production, communication and sharing learning. 3 different streams: operational energy, embodied and whole life carbon, and place and nature. So whereas the Zero Carbon Hub was very much on operational carbon, this is much broader, and that makes it very interesting. Currently up to a team of 6, started last autumn. We're starting to produce stuff, but the last person only joined a week ago, so we're kind of ramping up. But what I'm saying are my views, not theirs. So now you've been warned. Look, really, really interesting stuff that you guys, Passivhaus, are doing, and ABC. Has to be said, it will not surprise you. You know, the house builder's default position is what's the lowest cost. They comply. Lowest cost, and if things change, they don't want them to change very much. I would say all, or certainly most, would and do support a step in the house building, you know, requirements, specifications. And that kind of feels a bit like they've done their bit. Now someone else can sort the problem out. Yeah? Generation, storage, transmission. As long as we are using a net zero energy source and we've kind of saved a bit, can't we say we've done? Yeah? Spoiler alert. I don't know what the answer is. I mean, we've got two people before me that clearly knew. I unreservedly don't know the answer. But someone pays for net zero. That's either the buyer of the house, that's the energy bill payers generally, particularly those that use most that probably aren't in new homes, or landowners getting less for their value for their land. I think, though, we probably can all agree we are aiming for an optimal outcome here, and that includes cost along the way. And that's kind of where my head says, great solutions, are they really optimal? It'll definitely go that way. The question is, does it go all the way? And also, house builders have legitimate concerns here. They are currently building 750 or completing 750 homes per day. Government wants them to do 1,200 a day. So this is a hell of a step. If you were saying they all need to be passive house, how many passive houses have been built so far in the UK? 1,700? Day and a half's production, yeah? I mean, so they are concerned about the costs. They are really concerned about how the hell would you deliver it. Look, guys, you do a fantastic job because I know it's really hard, yeah? And genuinely, they know it's really hard too, and go, how would we keep going? Because they have to keep their production going, otherwise their businesses fall over. So this isn't about saying it's the wrong answer, if it turns out to be the right answer, it's how do we get there is actually a really important question. I mean, ultimately, the approach to net zero, that's a huge decision, billions and billions of pounds, yeah? And certainly the lesson we learned from Zero Carbon Hub, and it's not really a lesson, you all know it, you've got to take all the stakeholders along with you, and they've got to be on board. They've got to buy into this, yeah? I mean, we did all kinds of things when the Omicron virus came out that no one would have said were possible 6 months before, because we kind of all understood the problem. So we got a bit of a process to go here. And the point is we need an optimized spec of new homes within an energy system. I mean, the reality is we can expand the energy system. There isn't a limit to it, inverted commas. It might not be sensible to expand it further than National Grid have currently assumed, but it is something we could do. And that's not a sort of major house builder cop-out argument, because you can take that obviously too far, but it is a genuine question. What is that right optimal? Because actually it does have serious concerns here. If we're looking at the cost of generation, storage and transmission versus the extra cost you're spending on a dwelling, and then you mix in the energy use and the peak load, nice graphs, Sarah, I'd like to dig behind those. And clearly these are all additional load that we're adding into the house. Every new home is an additional load, however we look at it. And that is an opportunity, if you're piling in with 300,000 a year of them, to help solve problems with the energy demand balance, not create bigger ones. And of course, there's the capacity to deliver. It's great saying you need more wind turbines, but if you simply can't put that many more new turbines in per year and everyone else is saying that's the answer, it kind of doesn't work. And of course, ultimately, they've got to be comfortable, affordable, and really desirable places to live. Now, CCC has done quite a bit of work in this space, helping to identify what is that optimal. And the Net Zero Carbon Builder Standards Task Group are doing some, I'm looking across at Chris there, and will be doing more, yeah? I would argue from a main house builders perspective, we really need to kind of build on that. And I think we collectively have the opportunity to bring them along to understand actually why the optimal is wherever it needs to be, and actually engage with it as this is critically important, and know there aren't other easy solutions. You can't simply pass it to someone else. It may not go quite as far as the active house or passive house. But if we discover that and they are part of that process, then that's a really good place for them to engage and actually put their incredible resources into, rather than just complying, actually solving a bigger problem. And perfect. And the point here is that if you've looked at the 2025 draft notional standard, who's looked at it? Yeah. If you do, you'll weep. Yeah, because it's incoherent, and it's kind of got elements that are nearly passive house, but then buggers it up at the end. Yeah. So there's actually something really important to go for here, because the trajectory on isn't potentially not optimal, but it actually doesn't also make a lot of sense. I mean, I cannot believe you'd put trickle vents in triple glazed windows, let alone make them double the size. Yeah, come on. And I can't believe we'll spend the next 3 years putting PV on houses following 2021 and wastewater heat recovery, obviously with a gas boiler, because that is the cheapest route to compliance. Yeah, and then in 2025 go, oh, we don't have to bother with PV, and we don't have to bother with wastewater heat recovery or all those other technologies we put in. All we've got to do is improve the fabric a bit and put a heat pump in. Tick. Yeah, that cannot be the answer. The question is, over the next, say, 6 months, can we work together to identify what really is the answer? And it may end up at either of the two speakers' answers. I'm just admitting I don't know, but actually we need to go along a process to find it out, because that way we engage industry to do it and don't end up with a bun fight. Thank you.
Great. There's so many things to challenge in that, but I'm going to let you do that for me. If the speakers don't mind joining me again at the front, that would be great. Thank you. So we've heard several different cases, and I'm going to summarize the last one as being we need to find the cost optimal way of doing things, or maybe not. You may summarize it completely differently. So at that point, I'm going to hand straight over. We've got 15 minutes or so, maybe 20 if we need it, for us to raise your questions, to please pass them to the panel. We've also got Sarah with us, I think. Is still here. Can we put Sarah on the screen so that we can see her as well? Is that possible? Excellent. So great. Sarah's still with us as well. It's all working so far. I can't believe this. Great. So anybody in the room got a question that they'd like to have? We've also got a roving mic, so kindly provided by the Ecology Building Society people. So if you'd like, you've got a question in the room, please put your hand up. And we've got Joel. And then I'm going to take one from outside the room, one from online, and one in the room. I'm going to alternate, so we don't do it all evenly.
Afternoon, everybody. Quick question for the Active Building Centre. Is that ABC? Is that right?
Joel, do you mind just saying who you are and where you're from?
Sure, yeah. Joel Callow from Beyond Carbon, Passivhaus Designers. I love the idea of a house that generates revenue for the occupant. How are you getting negative numbers in the running costs of that active house?
Because during the summers, they're over-generating and they could sell it back to the grid. And during the winters, when they purchase it from the grid, and they're using smart export guarantee as the tariff, so you can, the overall average annual running cost is a negative number. So it's not.
Could you explain the smart export thing? Because that's where we've fallen over in the past with just getting a very sort of marginal rate for exported energy.
So we've used the smart export guarantee of 5 pence per kilowatt. So we've compared that against 28 pence per kilowatt that the current prices are at.
Great. And is Laura visible?
Yes, behind
Excellent.
a pillar.
Hiding behind a pillar.
Sorry.
Great. So do you have a question from online, Laura?
We do have a couple. Kick off with one from Alison Vipon from PhD Patron Member Ecology Building Society, very topical. She says, the government unveils the Energy Security Bill today, and while it has some good stuff in it, including overhauling EPCs and expecting energy companies to install a proportion of heat pumps, it doesn't have anything on energy efficiency. Total missed opportunity. Can any of you comment on this, please? And also, do you have any inside knowledge that could give us hope?
Okay, who wants that hospital pass? David?
I'll take it. I'll take it. I'll take it. Obviously, you know, are we surprised? No. We didn't really expect anything, albeit, of course, something absolutely should have been in it. I simply don't understand why. And I feel very much for bays in particular, because when we talk to officials, even politicians, they are desperate to do stuff, but the government structure doesn't allow it. And it's incoherent. They couldn't have been clearer with the CCC's report, particularly buildings, how badly buildings are doing, particularly in the owner-occupier sector. So you kind of shake your head a bit. Is something going to come down the line? I'm an optimist. I see quite a few because I recognise you from 15 years ago. It's going to happen, albeit I'm afraid with the current government only in particular places. But maybe it's so bad that we will get the swing going the other way, and actually a raft of decent policies follow.
I think that's right. I'm going to exercise Chair's prerogative on this one and say that's a question that doesn't really differ between us. I think we're all in the same position to say that it's ridiculous that they don't consider energy efficiency, and it could address so many different agendas in terms of local levelling up, skills, jobs. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that question. I think everybody would have a similar viewpoint. We've got a question here, Robert.
Yeah, hi, Robert Cohen from Verco Energy Consultants. I think I'd like to challenge David. The two words cost optimal have been the bane of building regulations forever. I've just put my head in my hands with despair when I hear that being used as the sort of right direction of travel. They don't allow for externality costs. They don't allow for co-benefits. They are an economist view of the world, which is, it's basically sending us into civilization collapse.
I guess I would answer that by saying it's not perfect, but it would give us a structure to have a conversation. I suspect if we don't start to have that conversation, we just end up with a bun fight between those that want to go really, really strong and those that will do as little as possible. And so it's really, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation about other framing that will actually engage house builders who, whether we like it or not, and particularly with the current government, are extremely influential. And we need to try and engage them with the problem, because ultimately we will only solve it if we come together. So happy about framing. Somehow I want to create a movement to a process such that we actually get 2025 regs into a space that is better than it is today and real and happens.
So to be specific then, what should be the cost of carbon used in a cost optimal calculation?
See, I wouldn't even use carbon, because we have to move to a zero carbon fuel. What we're worried about is kilowatts of zero carbon fuels, kilowatts and kilowatt peak. So very genuinely, there is an element of understanding what the energy system can provide, and therefore in the context of limits to different sectors, what limits do those sectors have to live within? And I think that may be not a perfect framing, but at least you can have a decent conversation about that.
You don't have a zero carbon supply at the moment.
No, we don't, but we are headed in that direction. And the answer in terms of accelerating it is from a new home building perspective, effectively, we need to factor that in, that time frame, and that does inform that outcome. More than happy to put that into the mix. I'm just trying to look for a language that means we actually move this forward and not just have a he said, she said argument, which is where it frankly is at the moment.
Interesting. I'm going to move on from there, if you don't mind. Sarah had a hand up and would like to join in. So, Sarah.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just taking that kind of response and thinking, should it be the house builders who are driving that discussion? We in Scotland, there was a citizens' assembly where they got a representative cross-section of society, and 97% were supportive of implementing Passive House as the national standard for all new buildings within the next 5 years. And it feels like if that's being curtailed or not taken forward because of a very small group of companies who are doing this on a purely commercial or have a very commercial viewpoint on this, it feels like it's the wrong place to start. And if, as you're saying, there's always going to be those companies who go to the very bottom of what's required, it's like, why don't we legislate now for a Passive House and set that as the target, and set that, it could be a 2025 target so everyone can see it coming and get prepared. But if that's what's best for us as a country, if that's what the citizens of the country want, that's what we should be doing. We shouldn't be doing these tiny little incremental improvements to make sure that everyone's bottom line is protected. We're living in a climate collapse, as was just pointed out, and we've got to be really bold in what we do going forward.
If I could just respond, I'm not arguing for incremental steps. I'm just making the point that if you have that fight, then you're taking on some really big boys. I'm just being a pragmatist. And actually, if it can be framed such that they can feel like part of the solution and understand why, and I appreciate all of the people in this room are probably saying, how can they not know? Believe you me, they don't. They don't. So, and I'm not saying it has to be little steps. I'm just saying there are two different ways of looking at it. They are looking at it in one way, you're looking at another. And unless we can bridge it, I don't have confidence in the outcome.
It's interesting. I did like Robert's question about this cost optimal phrase as well, though, because there's a site that we came across recently in the south of England, 8,500 homes built to current standards, or planned to build to current standards. The cost of connecting to the grid, because the grid doesn't have capacity to supply those extra homes, £90 million. 90 million. 8,500, that's £10,000 per dwelling. Where does that sit in your cost optimal equations? So there are different ways of looking at these things as well.
And it does sit in the equation, bearing in mind the government are just about to move all those costs off the house builder onto you.
Okay, so
could I add?
Of course.
Sorry. I just want to add, I think everyone has a viewpoint, but it has to be a journey where everyone has to come together and go ahead and find solutions. Everyone is presenting questions and challenges, but it has to be a journey because all of us have questions and we are all new to it. Nobody has the answer to it, but it has to be a journey where we all come together and find those solutions, because we are facing a similar problem of cost on one of the industrial projects that I just highlighted. When they did a cost calculation at the early stages, at REBA stages, and now when they're doing it at the procurement stage, the cost has gone by double because of the energy prices, the supply chain issues and everything. And the first instance that was the contractor's solution was to cut down on the fabric, which is not the solution, but because they can be held accountable on the monitoring side of the things and the energy bills after 5 years, they cannot do that anymore. So I think it has to be a journey because they're new to it as well. So I think if we don't educate people alongside us, then we're never ever going to reach our target. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, everybody. So Laura, do we have another question from online?
Just to sort of feed into the cost optimal, we did have a comment right at the very beginning of this from Lynn Sullivan, who, to add into this question, says the government is totally silent on the real costs. It's pretty obvious house builders will prefer a supply side solution because taxpayers and customers will pay through bills rather than the house builders forking out for better quality fabric without the performance gap. So it's part of that same discussion. But to change the subject completely, what about overheating? Dan Bilton asks, has anyone analysed the new Part O limiting solar gains, maximum areas of glazing, which appears from first glance to conflict with passive house design? Percent of floor area as glazing 18% north facing, 18% east, 15% south, 11% west, non-cross vented, not in London. And I believe currently building control will not accept PHPP as evidence of compliance. So how does the new Part O affect the question?
Anyone like to pick up on that from the panel?
Oh,
Sarah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, we'll let Sarah go first while I take a breath.
I took that as a wave.
Yeah, I'll do it. We have been looking at the new Part O, and we've been doing modeling in PHPP to see how that sits with the simplified method and the dynamic method to see if it provides a good solution, actually, where those two methods, for example, the dynamic method would be very challenging for a lot of small companies to be able to do those overheating calculations, and the simplified method is maybe not detailed enough. The new PHPP version 10, which came out in May, has a new overheating stress test included in the calculation. So you can stress test the design for future climate scenarios. You can stress test it for changes in occupant behavior. So it's really robust in terms of making sure that passive house buildings do not overheat. We also at the Passivhaus Trust have a plugin which you can use, and you can do a full risk assessment of the building for summer overheating. And it's really useful. It's a free tool. So I recommend everybody has a look at that. And I don't think there's any conflict in terms of what building regulation says compared in terms of the percentages compared to passive house, because passive house is not although it's passive, it's not a solar passive solution. You are utilizing the solar gains that come into the building, but you're not designing around those. There's also different ways of certifying and designing a passive house. So we've got the space heat demand method, which is the one we often talk about, but there's also a peak heat load method, which really kind of decouples the solar gains from that energy calculation. So you can have a building which the orientation has much less impact on meeting the passive house standard. So lots of ways, lots of routes to compliance and ways to make sure that our buildings, our passive house buildings in particular, are really robust in terms of future climate change and the new building regulations. So I don't think there's a conflict.
Anybody else want to pick up on this?
Just to add on the second part, like they had asked for the building compliance accepts PHPP as, I think in Wales they've published recently that all social housings can use PHPP as a method of compliance to demonstrate compliance. So which is a big step forwards, I think.
You'll be pleased to know that this is on our list of our policy activities at the Trust, is engagement to make sure that that's accepted in the UK, in the English regulations as well as in Wales. David, did you want to come up?
Yeah, so obviously PHPP isn't currently, and Part O, we're still working through the implications of it. And it's really important that all designers and builders really look into Part O, not least for the manner in which it changes window design, let alone from an overheating perspective. There are safety elements that have been built into it that can massively trip you up without you realising. I think there are still quite a few wrinkles that will need to be worked through. It's very much the first pass at it. It's in regs, and I don't think it was particularly well designed, but we've been trying to get it to be more functional, but I think there's a long way to go.
Great, thank you very much. And we're going to take another question. So Margaret, the front here, we got this microphone. Sorry, Margaret, just wait for the microphone, don't mind. Thank you.
I'm Margaret Reynolds. I'm architect doing retrofit at Enerfit. I wonder if Pragya could explain how a contract works where the contractor is accountable for the performance of the houses.
In this particular project, the client is working on a green lease where they're going to build certain things, but it is also like the energy sprung approach, which has been very common, that the contractor has to promise certain benefits of the performance, which is, I think, about, I'm not sure, but it is about for 20 years, they have to guarantee the performance. The contractor has to guarantee 20 years, and this has been followed on retrofit. And I think we are working very closely with one of the new build projects, which is going to be UK's first energy sprung approach, where the contractor has to promise certain performance targets. And if it's a social housing, they work on a basis of a comfort plan for the occupants, where the occupants pay a sort of additional cost for the certain level of comfort. So they're guaranteed 21 degrees temperature throughout the year, with certain kilowatt usage, and if you use more than that, then you pay extra over it.
And who monitors?
If it's a social housing, I'm assuming here it would be the social housing, the landowners. And for this particular project that we are working with on the industrial building in Cross Hands, it's ABC who's going to monitor it. So we are responsible for monitoring and the metering specs, and we are going to work very closely with the architects and the M&E consultants on the project.
So these contracts are a very interesting idea, isn't it? And the importance of having an independent person doing the monitoring and review. Sarah, do you want to come in on this? Or you got a hand up?
I was just going to mention, this isn't necessarily for retrofit, this is for all buildings. Up in Scotland, there's a really interesting thing which people could look up that's being rolled out by the SFT, so the Scottish Futures Trust. So for all new education buildings which are getting funding through them, there's a performance link to the funding. So the buildings are monitored for 25 years post-completion, and the funding goes to the local authority based on the performance of that building, and they lose 1% of their funding for the energy metric that they have for every 2 kilowatt hours extra the building uses than planned. So that's 2 kilowatt hours per meter squared per annum, which is massive, and it's completely changed the nature of the education kind of landscape in Scotland. And we now have like a huge number of projects which are coming through as Passivhaus, because people see that as a safe way to go forward, because they know there's not the performance gap which is rife within new build domestic and non-domestic buildings. And actually that same metric is going to be used for their retrofit program for education buildings in a trial as well.
Great. And David, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just I delivered 40 Energy Sprongs in Nottingham, and actually it was the solutions provider that did the monitoring, but all data was provided to the social housing and audited by them. So I think it can sit in different places, and I'm happy to chat as to some of the lessons we learned. And boy, we learned some lessons.
Thank you, everybody. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take one last question from online, and then we're going to do some voting. So, Laura, have you got one more question, or?
We can wrap two up together, I guess, which is a question about a driver for energy efficiency coming from home buyers and renters. So Sinead Garcia asks, do the panelists see the demand for energy efficient homes coming from the home buyers, renters, especially with the rise in energy costs? And in a kind of a related way, and tying back to financing and funding, then Chika Igwe asks, prospective homeowners have little difficulty seeing the sense for net zero buildings when presented with business cases, especially for retrofitting. But UK government's attempts to help have only marginally addressed this by limited grants directly and through energy suppliers, but not available to many homeowners. Is there a place for financial institutions, as their social responsibility perhaps, to be compelled to come on board to offer more lucrative options for homeowners to upgrade the vast majority of the existing housing stock?
Okay, I'm going to go to David first, because you're a major house builder representative, so sales values and lending.
The major house builders typically, it may be shifting now, frankly, but I think their mindset takes a very long time to shift. So they broadly don't believe they get better sales value to overcome the costs. What I would like to see government do, though, is factor stamp duty up and down based on the energy performance of the dwelling, which won't be a surprise to John. And we have been lobbying hard for that, and various other, not the Future Homes Hub, other organisations I work for. Indeed, we got one of the major banks in front of the Chancellor last week. And of course, he's the ex-Chancellor as of last night. But it is starting to get socialised, because unless we have that demand at scale, we will struggle. I'll talk to you afterwards. Well, there are 5 banks have raised it with him independently. So that's 5 of the 8 top banks.
Sarah or Pragya, do you want to come in on this, or?
Just to respond on to the question where if there's a demand, I don't know about exactly how many people need it, but I know about one of the strategy projects that we are working on. And the house is in fuel poverty, where they cannot afford to heat the homes. And we asked the tenant if they would like to pay more bills, and if they would like to have their house comfortable, or would they like to have solar PV and things like those to reduce the cost of running. And the first question was, the house needs to be comfortable because I'm tired of living in an uncomfortable house. So I think there is the demand because people want to live in comfortable homes, and there would be eventually we need to meet up those demands.
Sarah, do you have anything to add, or?
Not really. I mean, I think that's it. We need to make sure that the buildings are comfortable and affordable. And I think the general public just needs more education on how they can do that, what they can ask for, how they can create the demand. Because I think that we can't rely on it being a demand side approach. It's got to be driven by legislation. We've got to deliver those buildings so people have a choice in having that low energy, comfortable, healthy home to live in.
And just I'm going to end this on a final note of hope. This year in May, for the first time ever, we managed to get together 10 private sector developers in a private meeting in a room, and they all have done a passive house project or have nearly completed one. And the bulk of them were reporting an uplift in sales value of between 5 and 20%. And that may be a very new, recent thing because of the cost of fuel increases that have happened very recently. But also HBF survey, for the first time ever, had energy efficiency in one of the top 3 things that people, home buyers, are looking for when selecting a new home. Always used to be not even in the top 10, or 9 or 10, if it was in the top 10. Now one of the top 3 items because of the cost of fuel. So there is some potential hope for that driving demand question. So I'm just going to ask you for some questions, some voting now. Laura, are you ready to do voting? We've got a poll for this as well, so we're going to try and run this online and in the room as well. God, how's this going to work? And I've given one question to each speaker, or relating to each speaker, and they haven't seen them, so they might not like me for this. So question 1 is, should we require on-site renewables? So the idea of an active building, should that be a requirement that we should go for that approach? And we've got a yes, no, don't know in all of this. Laura, are we doing this? Just this one first, and then all 3 together. Second question relates to then the passive house question, which is, should passive house be set as the minimum fabric performance for all new buildings? So the fabric performance. And then the third one is relating to David's approach, which is it okay to rely on grid decarbonisation to achieve operational net zero carbon? I'm going to vote no for that one. It's not a pejorative question at all. I'm not trying to lead you in any way or shape or form. Okay, so Laura, how is this voting going to work now? Do you?
Well, the answers are still coming in online. But,
great, so they're voting online live. So shall I just do the voting in the room now?
Yeah, and great, after each question I can feed
great, and then you give us a vote from the online? Okay, magic. So question 1, should we require on-site renewables for all buildings? New buildings. Yeses, please put your hand up if you're a yes. Okay, that's about 50–60%, I would say. Many more on that side. Why is there many more on that side than on this side? What's going on? Okay, how many no's are there? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay, so 10%. And don't knows. How many people don't know? Okay, 5% don't know, 10% say no, and all the rest, so 85% yes. There we go. It didn't look like 85%, but maybe some people didn't vote. Laura, what have we got online?
It's not that dissimilar. We have a lot more maybes online, 34%, but the majority is yes, 52%, and only a handful of no's at 14%.
Okay, so we've got a similar position, but slightly different numbers. Great, so question 2 then, should passive house be set as the minimum fabric performance for all new buildings? So, yeses. Ooh, well there's a surprise. 85% plus 90%, I would say, in this room. No's, put your hand up. 1, 2, okay, not so lonely anymore, excellent. And don't know. 1, 2, okay, 6, 7, so 10% in the room. Don't know. Laura, what have we got online?
How interesting, it's almost an exact match. So only 3 people have said no, which is 5%, 12% maybes, and the overwhelming majority, 82%, say yes.
Fantastic, so very similar statistics, so that's very good. Okay, and on to the last question, this fairly balanced question about the way the major house builders are going to approach it. Is it okay to rely on grid decarbonisation to achieve operational net zero? Yes. Anybody saying yes? Oh, Joel. Okay, 1. Excellent. And we're going to talk to you and find out why afterwards. I'm sure there's a reason. Okay, no. How many no's have we got? Okay, that's even better. That's 95%, I think, of the room. And then don't know. Does anybody not know? Wow, great. Excellent. And you were just being awkward, weren't you, Joel? You just wanted to make it not standard. Fantastic. So, guys, thank you very much for that. Oh, sorry, online number, you're right. Laura.
Nothing new to add, really. Two yeses, but 82% no's and a little more uncertainty, 14% maybes.
I would be interested to know why people are saying yes. So I'm going to chat to people in the half-time break, because I thought I'd worded it so it wouldn't be that way. Anyway, so we're going to take a break now. We're not going to have quite as long as I thought. We're going to go through until 3:30. For the people in the room, it's tea and cake in the other garden room. So if you can be back just after 3:30, that would be great. Oh, and Kirsten is just telling me we've got small fairy cakes for everybody for our birthday party. So thank you very much. And thank you to our panel as well. Sorry. Great, so thank you very much for everybody coming back. For the people online, you've missed the cake. I don't know how the cake and biscuits translated, but I hope you enjoyed your tea and whatever you had yourself. And also I'd forgotten how awkward it is and difficult it is to get everyone to come back after when they're all chatting away in real life, in person. So that is something we've missed. We're going to move straight on now to the retrofit session, which I think is probably a bit more nuanced in terms of Passive House and where we sit in the net zero retrofit debate or positioning. Again, we've got 3 speakers, and again, one of those speakers will be online. So our 3 speakers for this part are Chris Twin, who's talking on behalf of Letty today, and he's going to be talking about the work of Letty and the need, the average position for retrofit targets. We've also got Andy Simmons from AECB, and I don't know why I'm looking for him because he's not in the room. He's online. Sorry, I was looking for his face. And he's going to be talking about the idea of setting targets and then giving yourself allowances for difficulties on the buildings that you're treating. And then finally, we've got Anne-Marie Fallon from Archetype, who's going to be giving the case for why Passive House is the answer, or Passive House retrofit. So the NFIT standard is the answer to the retrofit question. So that's it from me. I'm going to hand straight over to Chris and ask him to start the debate.
Great. Thank you, John. Yes, I'm here representing Letty. I'm going to run through most of this lot, but more particularly give you an update as where our retrofit research is going, because we're doing a retrofit part 2 guide shortly, and I thought it would be useful to provide you a little heads up. Whether it's an average or not will remain to see. I know that I can see a number of Letty people in here, but I felt I ought to explain who Letty are. More than 1,000 individuals, professionals, non-aligned volunteers, who came together 3, 4, almost 5 years ago, with a view to trying to work out what good looks like for practitioners, given the climate emergency declarations. I've also, in the bottom, crossed out our old web page, which was London. The last 2 years have rather illustrated we're far wider than that. So we're now .uk. So we're going through a name change. Instead of the London Energy Transformation Initiative, it's Low Energy Transformation Initiative. We've now been registered under that name. So that's where we're roughly coming from. Enough said. What we realized pretty early on was that zero carbon is changing. I was involved in the BED-Z project 25 years ago, and we were on the far left, building level zero carbon. We're now working as a use case scale. We heard this implied earlier on that debate. And we have transport industry and a whole set of other things to be involved. And what I want to do is give you a little bit of heads up as to how that potentially changes where we need to go. Climate emergency guide we produced tried to set targets as to what was appropriate looking at top down and bottom up. How much renewables we could, green energy we could produce, divvy that up, industry, transport, buildings and so on. Lo and behold, it came remarkably close to passive house for new build, but there wasn't one mention of passive house in the document because we're trying to be impartial. But that is the kind of level that we're looking at. Not least of all, working from the bottom up is pragmatic. And as I mentioned to someone earlier, you also have a 20% cost benefit because there's no VAT. Therefore, why aren't we doing it? Retrofit, on the other hand, is a different ballgame. Retrofit Part 1, for which we're very grateful for people who have come out supporting it, looked at what best practice was, looked at processes, looked at things you have to consider, the need to look at it holistically and so forth and so on. But we knew when we were doing it, we were circumnavigating certain difficult issues. So although we've set standard, we've established a best practice, which loosely speaking aligns with ACB at a certain level, but is very clear on what you need to do to try and achieve that. So it becomes less of a black box. And for that reason, you know, we're beginning to see LETI guidance coming into planning policy as a clearer direction because it appeals more to a wider audience. But those elephants in the room, it did not align with where the UK was going at a top-down level. The Committee on Climate, change the name, Climate Change Committee, sixth carbon budget. The energy efficiency needed of our total building stock is 12%. That's it, nothing else. It's far cheaper to build those wind turbines, which were mentioned earlier. And that's reflected on their diagram on the right here. The energy efficiency is that much, and heat pumps, which are obviously using that grid and renewable supply, is picking up the lion's share. But there's other key issues within the CCC's work. They managed to sell it to the politicians to get it embedded into law on basically it will cost us no more than 1% of GDP each year between now and 2050. Now, you then work that out, and that ain't very much per house. If you consider that cost is for all those other sectors as well, if you only used it for retrofitting housing, it's 45 grand a house for 28 million homes. Our best case study in part 1 was 60,000. It doesn't work. In fact, the CCC has £1,000 per home on average, plus a heat pump. I paraphrase, but that's basically what our research has identified. So we then started at this retrofit Mark II, how many, how deep, and for what cost? The nitty questions. So we wanted to identify shortfalls in the straw man which CCC has put up. As mentioned earlier, issues of fuel poverty, top down, meeting the cost limits, so forth and so on, past 2035 compliant and occupant responsive, because we didn't feel a lot of what was out there was responding to what occupants were telling us were their priorities. This is only a draft, but the image here is significant. There are different shades within the answer. I'm not going to go through this, but if you're trying to manage a work stream of 80 people, you're looking at CCC, interrogation, fabric, systems, cost, trying to integrate those, a stock model, which John Palmer put together for us previously at Passivhaus Trust, how to get to zero carbon for zero cost 2050, and the social aspects. Try managing that process. This is roughly where we think the numbers start to come out. Enefit, and I put Energy Strong roughly in the same kind of level, although it's not judged in the same way because it's a cost model, between 10 and 20% of the market. I'll be interested in whether you think you can ramp up to that level, because that would feed back into that process. I'm skeptical. Letty best practice, about 25%. Historical buildings, the remainder, we think we can shrink that to about 1% or so forth of the market. And the remainder, we think we need a new standard. And we're calling it Letty Basic. I'll go into that in a little bit of depth, because I know it might grate with some of you in this room. In essence, we've taken feedback from people. Certainly I had an involvement in the Green Deal and so forth. Single point of contact. We don't want dozens of people turning up. Keeping the front facade. We made an early decision. We weren't going to touch the front facade. And what we did was we took this archetype far deeper than we did in retrofit 1, because we wanted to apply an awful lot of extra thinking that would not normally get applied to an individual dwelling. So, front facade, looking at lack of space. Forget that hot water cylinder for an air handling, for the air source heat pump. It doesn't work. And various other things within that. We came up with a way of doing Letty Basic, and then a way of progressing, if you wish to, onto higher standards with the various different levels we're looking at for costs. I'll come to that in a moment. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but we are going for MVHR, and I'll offer you just a little taster. If you go for 80% efficiency as opposed to 90 or 92%, the price comes down from 1,600 quid on a good day down to 450 quid. It's cheaper than demand-controlled extract ventilation with those trickle ventilators. There's also other things to do with how we want to replace the boiler with the thermal store, phase change thermal store. You want to retain all the insulation, the heating system. That means the fabric first. The objective is make sure you don't need to touch the heating system, other than replace the middle of it. And then finally, costs. There's a number of things CCC did. Well, first of all, they assumed the cost of electricity went down because wind turbines were getting cheaper. This is our estimate of COVID, Ukraine, probably set back when 1% above inflation sort of thing. We realized things weren't working. We also realized we will be a net exporter of renewables, not an autonomous, we will use it all ourselves. It will be so bloody expensive, it's better to sell it to them who have a deficit, and we reduce our bills, and you push up, in theory, our GDP. So we're looking at a whole set of games here for coming up with a way of presenting it as we can pay for all of this without exceeding the 1% GDP. What is interesting, though, is yes, we get modest and useful gains from benefits of healthcare, reduced healthcare because of good homes, but we have very little chance of being able to tap into that money given how poor the pay for nurses. That money isn't going to come back to us. It's, we may suggest we can get a little bit of it, but we can't rely on it. So we're looking at modest but useful. And there's various other things to finish. We are there also looking at a supplementary retrofit surcharge on generating profits. This is exactly the mechanism which happened for gas in the North Sea. It gushed out of the ground, and they sold it at world prices. So the government then took a slice of profit. We won't be able to use all of that because Treasury will be looking to replace their tax on petrol and things like that. But we believe there is something there we ought to be looking at because of fuel poverty and so forth. That's a snapshot. I'll leave you that with a summary. We're looking at roughly halving heat demand and 0 extra cost, a mix of different standards. And yes, we'll need some new products and a new way of doing things when it comes to interventions in your typical house. And by the way, there's a retrofit 3 Letty guide coming for non-domestic shortly. Watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Chris. And you lost your microphone. Do you mind just clipping yourself back on for later? That'd be great. Excellent. That's a really interesting take, isn't it? The idea of this intermediate standard. I'm probably more amenable to that on the retrofit side than I was on the new build side. So we'll move straight on to our second presenter. Again, I'm looking for him. This is crazy. Andy Simmons from AECB, and he's going to take it, I think, it's down a similar kind of route, but from a completely different angle, I think. So, Andy, please take it away.
Thanks, John. Okay, so let me get my presentation up. Is that okay? Can everyone see that? Deafening silence. I can see, you can see it. Yeah. So, John, I'm not talking exactly about what you said I'm talking about. It's not dissimilar in many ways to what Chris was talking about, and it's really interesting in a way to follow directly from that. So I don't have 80 people to coordinate on the research the ACB's been doing into our retrofit, into our approach to retrofit and retrofit standards. We've got a small group, that's Alan Clark, Sarah Price, Gervais Manguano of Waxwing Energy, Mark Siddle, and myself. And we basically convened this group because we wanted to rise to the challenge of those people who've been criticising those people who they perceived as sort of over promoting the benefits of deep retrofit, particularly when it comes to understanding whole life carbon and so on. So we rose to that challenge and took on a bit of research. So a bit of background, ACB's got 1,800 members at the moment, which is good. It's going up. And we've got quite a few students joining as well, which is always good. We've developed 5 standards to date. We have the building standard, which is for new build. This is a self-certification system based on the Low Energy Buildings database. We have the retrofit standard, and there's information on the website on that. Where I've put full fabric retrofit, that really just describes what the current standard is. And what I'll be talking about in the next few slides is what we might call a heat pump retrofit or a light retrofit. We have a lifetime carbon standard, which is really just getting people to use a carbon accounting tool, pH ribbon specifically, in order to compare and contrast construction assemblies as part of their work and encourage them to move towards lower embodied carbon forms of construction. There's a daylight standard and there's a long-standing and under-promoted water standard, water efficiency standard. Okay, so first of all, the current ACB standard, which Chris mentioned. So just in context there, you can see how the key criteria relate to our new build standard, Enerfit and Passivhaus. So just very quickly, you can see there is a space heating limit on people wanting to achieve the ACB standard of 50 kilowatt hours. There are lots of good reasons why exemptions might be needed, very good reasons, whether it's an inability to put insulation on walls due to boundary conditions or listed building status, for example. And we've set a maximum 100 kilowatt hours per meter squared in year for some building types, but it has to be well reasoned to get those exemptions. We've set an air change rate of 2. So this is NFIF, this is not permeability as it stands at the moment. There's an overheating limit, very similar to Passivhaus, and there's a requirement to deal with thermal bridges and to minimize the risk of condensation in construction junctions that have been treated, which is what that bottom criteria is about. So where the current retrofit standard, the full fabric retrofit standard sits, is here from a graphic I borrowed from Letty. So you can see that the ACB standard there is at 50, typical new builds about 85, and then you can see the existing stock there, the sort of space heat demand that we understand that is represented in all those different building types, flats, mid-terraces, semi-detached, and so on. I've just put a red ring around the ENERFIT component method because I'm probably more people present in the audience know more about this than I do, but I was under the impression that ENERFIT's certified under the component method maybe aren't quite as specific as, you know, that sort of 30 to 40 range. I thought that it could, buildings could be certified even if they're up at the sort of 65 kilowatt hours. So really it's just an open question. Okay, so this is draft. This is where our small working group has been considering how light a fabric retrofit is needed in order to meaningfully retrofit and usefully retrofit a building. So key criteria to achieve this standard are: we do require a whole house plan and an energy model that goes with that. PHPP is Passivhaus methodology underpins all of our standards, but we're thinking that we will allow SAP-based more energy models for this new standard. If I call it the step 1 standard and I call the full fabric step 2, that's maybe a bit clearer. So for this new step 1, we require a whole house plan and an energy model. And the idea of the whole house plan is, as and when and if a deeper retrofit is subsequently needed, nothing that's done in step 1 will block later measures if they're needed. And so the whole house plan is intended to show how the full ACB standard would be achieved in the end if it was implemented. This is focused specifically, the standard step 1, on moving off fossil fuel heating systems and onto a heat pump. We require at least cost parity to be achieved. So there's a question as to what do you have to do to achieve cost parity with gas or oil or whatever fossil fuel you're coming off. And we think the criteria below will sort of key criteria to help people achieve that. So we're limiting flow temperatures off the heat pump to be no more than 45 degrees C. Air permeability, note this is not air changes per hour, this is air permeability, Q50. We feel that for retrofit at scale, where you can't decant tenants, it's going to be quite a challenge even to get buildings down to 5. But we think it's it's not an unreasonable target to set for air tightness. We haven't put a limit on heat pump size or heat load. The standard does require ventilation is fitted, and at the moment we are, I think, reasonably clear that we're promoting MVHR or MEV, whole house MEV, and decentralized MEV, although we do have some concerns about air quality with the latter, decentralized MEV. Heat loss calculations are required as part of the heat pump system design, but what we're looking to do is to require certifiers to pass on the information from PHPP, some of the information, to the MCS approved people doing the calculations to try to bring those outputs closer together. And then the rest basically will be guidance. So that's where the sort of draft outline of the new standard is looking like it will sit. So we've been modeling this, and we've been modeling this at individual house level, and we've also been using the ACB stock model, which we worked with John Palmer on, where we compared the outputs of our stock model with his stock model, a bit of cross-checking. Now, so we have three house types, which really are form factor types. We have a semi-detached house, we have a bungalow, and we have a mid-terrace house. They represent poor, medium, and good form factors. And we have a series of PHPP files where we've looked at each of those 3 house types. we've played around with measures, with heat pumps, and looked at what happens in different situations. And we also have a version of those files between cavity walled houses and solid wall houses to look at sort of whether solid wall houses stand a chance of achieving the standard as well. So you can see this is just a snapshot of an output of, this is a typical cavity walled semi-detached house. It's assumed to have not very good cavity wall insulation, and the attic insulation has been topped up to 400 millimeters, and it's assumed to already have double glazed plastic windows. Typical house, typical cavity walled house. With a seasonal performance factor, or seasonal coefficient of performance for the heat pump of just under 3.5, you get to about cost parity with a phase one, a step one retrofit. And you can see, roughly speaking, that reduces the the space heating demand from the original house, which might be a whole house temperature of 17 degrees in the heating season, from about 16,000 kilowatt hours down to about 4,000 because of the efficiency of the heat pump. Step two, by comparison, full fabric to the ACB retrofit standard will bring space heat demand, the energy consumption, down to a much more reasonable 1,400 kilowatt hours. So just your sense of scale of the different, what we could achieve with the different interventions. So we also looked at the relationship of permeability. How important is reducing the air tightness of existing buildings at scale? And so we looked at the cost of running the heat pump compared to the cost of heating the house on gas. And we felt that across the different house types we were looking at, again, the air permeability of 5 is a reasonable target to aim for. You know, it does save money the more airtight it gets. Ideally, you'd aim for 2 or even 1. But we thought 5 was potentially practical, and it would help people achieve cost parity. Now, carbon. Okay, so 2 types of carbon we're concerned about is embodied carbon, lifetime carbon, but particularly the carbon burp, the cradle to practical completion, and operational carbon as well. We mustn't forget that. So context, National Grid, as Chris mentioned, is decarbonising. There are idealized scenarios, which are the coloured lines there. The National Grid has got a series of different decarbonisation curves predicted for the future, and the government uses their own curve. We must remember that, of course, that the sort of measured performance is slightly dirtier. The grid does run slightly dirtier at the moment for various reasons, which I won't go into here. As a general rule, we do not consider the carbon negative scenarios to be sensible scenarios to work to. You can see one of the scenarios there the government uses for public projects. Graph 3. Now this is where this starts to get really interesting, and so I must be careful I don't talk too long on this. I can chew it over in Q&A later. So what we've done, what we're showing in the bottom left graph is a typical semi-detached house, and we're looking at how many tons of carbon are emitted as a result of heating, just space heating that house. And then you can see time in years is the bottom axis. So we've taken that out. I've cut it, but it's out to 60 years, 60-year notional lifetime of this building. So what you can see there are the purple bars. This is tons of CO2 emitted from heating the building, space heating, if you're burning gas. Let's say in year 5, we do a retrofit. We put a heat pump on and we top up the insulation in the attic to 400 millimeters. We do some air tightness measures, pretty minimal. Now this assumes uninsulated floors, no solid wall insulation, but it does, as I said, assume double glazing is present. So what we're showing here is the carbon burp, as we call it, the upfront carbon from a heat pump. That's the orange bit, year 5. But you can see as a result of those minor measures and the heat pump operating at about 3.5 for a cavity wall insulated property, or 3.6 or so for a solid wall property, you can see that you slash the operational carbon emissions and you move over to electricity. Over the years subsequently, the grid continues to decarbonise, and so your emissions go down a little bit each year. So then we said, what happens if for all the other benefits of deep retrofit, health, well-being, quiet, all the avoided national health costs, all the co-benefits which we know about. If you did a retrofit later, now why might you do that? You might do it to capture some of those non-energy co-benefits. You might do it to further insulate yourself from energy costs. The government might realize they need to reduce the amount of peak power being used in the winter for all this electric heating. So they might decide to incentivize deep retrofit. For whatever reason, a retrofit is done 17 years later in year 22. Now there's a lot more materials go into that. So the upfront carbon emissions, the carbon burp is greater. It's around 6 tons, say. And you subsequently reduce your operational emissions a little bit more, but it's a bigger carbon burp. And then as the years roll forward, you have to maintain the house, which involves materials use, consumables, but particularly, say, 17 years later, which is the notional lifetime of a heat pump, you have to renew the heat pump. So there's another carbon burp there, and so on. That rolls forward in time. So that's what it looks like per year. But the question, if you look at number 4, bottom right there, what we're showing there is what happens if, in terms of cumulative carbon from that household. So you can see that after the first few years, you've got a trajectory of emitting more and more carbon from burning gas. If that carried on and you carried on burning gas, you can see the cumulative tonnage of carbon building up from that household over the years, completely unsustainable. So getting off fossil fuels and moving on to electricity through a phase 1 retrofit changes the trajectory and changes the amount of carbon accumulating in the atmosphere as a result of that household. It flattens that line. It doesn't completely flatten it. It's still slowly increasing for the reasons I've just described. If you did a deeper retrofit, phase 2, step 2, you emit more carbon, but you flatten the curve a little bit more. And although at the end of the 60-year period, it looks like you could well, as a household, have put more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere as a result of the deeper retrofit, it doesn't seem that big a carbon burp, and you've got all the other benefits of a deeper retrofit. Now, in terms of then going from the individual building up to scale, up to looking at how this all adds up to impact the national CO2 emissions, whether Great Britain or Scotland or England, or whatever, our model can look at the different regions. You have to make some assumptions. You have to assume that the domestic heat supply is decarbonising. We talked about that. You have to also assume or decide how will manufacturing energy be decarbonised. So we've looked around a bit and created a sort of not unreasonable but ambitious decarbonisation target over the years for manufacturing energy. And that you can change that in the model. Now, the other big factor is how many retrofits of what type happen when. So Tim Martell has recently sort of followed some scraggy sketches I sent him and adapted our model to help us understand, to nuance it a bit. So for example, what we're showing here, up on the left-hand side, you have the number of retrofits carried out per year and time along the bottom axis there. So we can create whatever scenario we want here. The one you're looking at just happens to show a lot of step 1s, a lot of heat pumps and light fabric retrofits being done between now and say 2040, say. And at the same time, maybe housing associations want to deal with fuel poverty a bit more robustly by doing full, deeper fabric retrofits, step 2 direct retrofits. And then in later years, as I said, the second wave of retrofits might be turning step 1s into step 2s, deeper retrofits.
Andy, can we move on last 2 minutes?
I think so, yeah. I think I'm on the last two or three slides, yeah. Okay, so this slide here describes what all of that looks like if you turn that into transforming the stock. So everything under the horizontal line is existing stock being transformed into different types of retrofit. So the solid orange line, for example, is a reducing number of untreated houses. And then the 2 green lines are different balance between step 1s and step 2s. And it also reminds us that we have notional targets for new house building, which is adding to our emissions. So in this particular scenario, we've just said what happens if all new homes are either ACB building standard or passive house, and that's the blue and the purple on top, adding to the emissions. So that ends up in reporting to two graphs here. This is consumption-based emissions, not territorial emissions. So this may not be the same language that governments speak. So what we've done is we've added up operational and embodied carbon. And you can see that there's a sort of a peak there from a big burst of retrofitting work, carbon burp, but it is basically reducing operational energy. And although embodied carbon emissions do add to the total, it's important, but not a deal breaker. And then finally, this last graph just adds up all of those things and shows it as cumulative CO2 equivalent emitted from the housing stock from operational and embodied carbon. And what you want to do with this is you want to flatten that curve, because that means that we are not adding more CO2 to the atmosphere. And of course, that's probably going to be impossible to do. So the flatter the curve, the better. That starts to suggest, brings in conversation about carbon budgets and how much do we need to, how much net is in the net zero? What do we need to do to offset those remaining emissions? Whistle stop tour. There we go.
Great, thank you, Andy. So I did reveal one problem about how to give a 2-minute warning when you're with an online speaker. So very interesting, again, the modelling, the air source heat pump led approach. So our final speaker then is going to be Anne-Marie. We've heard 2 versions of lighter retrofit options and approaches. And Anne-Marie is going to talk to us about the benefits of taking a full Enerfit approach. Anne-Marie.
Right, and we're right and left. And yeah, I'm at the end, so that means I have to talk really fast to try and get through everything, or skip slides. So I will talk really fast. Okay, so we carried out an extensive Enerfit informed retrofit plan with a particular client in the last 1.5 years. And obviously we've completed with other partners one of the first non-domestic, deep, low carbon retrofit Enerfit projects in the UK as well, in Cambridge. So if we get time, we'll talk about that. So who are Archetype? We've been around for 37, 38 years now. We have 3 regional bases. The most exciting one at the minute is the one that I'm based in, Edinburgh. And there's lots of really positive, exciting things coming out of Scotland in relation to enabling policy, as Sarah Lewis referred to earlier on today. We have a sister consultancy that sits alongside, and we find there's an increasing amount of work out there in terms of trying to help clients navigate their way through what really net zero is, what that process is, and how Passive House might fit into it. We've delivered a range and scale of different buildings in different sectors, so we feel Passive House is applicable to any building, and we do a lot of post-occupancy evaluation of our own buildings, but also others, which has been particularly interesting in leading us down the retrofit route as well with this particular client. So again, the new PHPB 10 and the kind of the additional issued criteria on Enerfit does allow for certain exemptions, and the particular focus on the client that we had, I'm going to skip that to come back to it at the end. The particular focus that the client had, City of Edinburgh Council, was around how do you retrofit or apply Enerfit principles or full Enerfit to a heritage city, so a city with heritage value in it, across an estate of non-domestic buildings. So the focus of this presentation is non-domestic in nature, education and office buildings. So we worked with our asset management team to establish what that profile of building looked like. Where do we start? We have all these aspirational standards and all these studies and kind of hypothetical modelling scenarios. But what Edinburgh wanted to get under was under the bonnet to see what did this physically mean for their work stream, for how they could actually put any capital budget to it if it was viable, and how it actually started to affect their buildings. So it's an ongoing conversation. It hasn't concluded really, because it's such an extensive conversation beyond the immediate client stakeholder that we work with. So in relation to looking at eras of construction, types of construction, we carried out various studies and worked out the different trends, and we were able to isolate and develop a methodology for Edinburgh, which is bespoke to them. So, applying the past 2038 methodology, taking lessons learned and looking at building characteristics as a real driver for what type of Enerfit you can take or retrofit project that you can take. So this involved an overview study of 400 buildings, 300 of which are conditioned. And we narrowed that down with the asset management team to 2 pilot deep dive studies out of a group of 12 buildings that they felt were representative of their general estate. Of course, there's huge abnormals in that with some very high heritage value buildings in Edinburgh, but this was extrapolated out to give a series of conclusions for them to then apply from a cost and measure-based analysis across the rest of the estate, which that conversation is still ongoing. So similar, and I really like Andy's idea of, the step 1 and 2, what you want to lock in earlier, you don't want to prevent doing deeper measures later. Edinburgh had quite a bespoke brief where they said, look, we're politically under pressure to go with the basic, the Letty basic, the lowest approach. Let's throw the heat pumps in there, do minimal fabric, or just change the heat pump in the first place and do nothing to the fabric. What does that look like? Because, we're already sold on Enerfit and Passivhaus. We're delivering new build Passivhaus schools. That's not the message, you need to tell us. We just need to know about the factors to allow us to go back to the political side of the client decision-making process. So broadly similar to some of the other scenarios that were mentioned today, there was 4 or 5 different scenarios and intervention scenarios identified. Option 4 being fully certified Enerfit, either by component or certain exemption-based, certain exemptions based on the heritage value. Middle of the road, which is looking at that MEV, maybe kind of slightly more relaxed air tightness, and various different bespoke, decentralized, centralized, or MEV ventilation options. What this also covered was very much a deep dive. So this wasn't just a light touch feasibility. We really got to grips with the buildings in terms of air testing, thermal imaging, opening up works. The 2 buildings just on the left-hand side that we chose there, one was an architectural conservation area, was going to have a much more internal insulated approach and the whole process, and the other 1970s kind of prefabricated, easy to strip back to start again, retrofit from the outside. The PHI's outfit project that's happening at the minute about deep Enerfit certified projects in Europe that don't disrupt the user, because these are educational buildings, it's not just housing. So we have limited 6-week windows in the summer to try and phase these works over a period of time. That drew out all the usual things around terrible air permeability, thermal bridging, et cetera, and also modelling those buildings accurately against several years of cost data from those buildings as well. So using John Parma's tool around the temperature reduction factor, when you're looking at different levels of retrofit, what the average temperature is of an existing building isn't 20 degrees all year, it's actually more like 13 degrees, and how retrofit measures can improve that average temperature over time. So a baseline was established. There was an assessment done on all the deep dive work that came from the pilots itself, and a series of measures were applied to the building. And you can see from the first 2 bars on the left, just because it's all a bit small, one is obviously MEP only, which we know doesn't deal with demand reduction, and that's what Edinburgh are interested in. Their actual local infrastructure to the city is at or almost at capacity, so the idea of throwing a lot more KVA demand on the grid, they're aware that this wouldn't be the kind of first choice, which seems to be the government's first choice at the moment. And we looked at a series of interventions. So it's not that we discounted certified Enerfit by heat demand on this initial listed nursery. We went with a kind of component method or heat demand method with exemption. So recognising that we couldn't put 250 mil on the outside of this building in terms of the harm and significance that would cause. And how this would actually realistically work in real life, so we can tell, you can say you can put a T-cozy insulation on listed buildings, but we can establish that's not really the case going forward. We worked with Harley Haddo, the M&E engineers, again to do kind of a deep dive into this study. So not just give us a heat demand and size of heat pump, actually go into detail on sizing, type of ventilation system. So as the heat pump design got smaller, the ventilation system obviously gets a bit more complicated, and we were trying to also comply with BB 101 because indoor air quality was another real brief requirement of the client in this case. But the really interesting thing, which was for the heat pump lovers without doing the fabric, was if we just stick a heat pump into this school, we go from having 19 radiators to 77 and a massive buffer tank outside and no space for learning and teaching. So we're actually creating a dysfunction in the buildings by just decarbonising it, especially in the non-domestic context. Of course, as we address the fabric, we come down to maybe 12 radiators, so we're actually maybe gaining that extra bit of space for artwork for the 5-year-old or whatever. So, and we looked at various kind of incremental assessments across that, also with the fabric, but we felt M&E really is important in this as well, that, what we don't want to end up with is another kind of, white elephant in terms of a heating trend. And we want to make these buildings independent of those heating trends as much as we can. Won't go into carbon too much detail because I don't have time. But on the left-hand side, I'm broadly, obviously, in agreement with what Andy's just promoted as well. The change from gas to electricity helps massively with the decarbonisation, but also the demand reduction is built into that figure too. So the overall carbon burp, as Andy described it, is there and existing, but over a 60-year profile is much, much less significant than it would be otherwise. Again, trying to visualize for the client. So, how can a client understand these measures? So we're trying to take that criteria and all these kind of modeling scenarios into kind of impactful reality to do with phasing, moving and consulting with stakeholders, users of the building, and what that means for retrofit for both types of buildings. So in terms of the approach taken with both, it was much easier to get a building like this, horrendous form factor, lots of other complexity, but actually much more easy to detail and strip out. And it was also bigger. So from a cost per metre squared perspective, looking at energy use intensity across the 300 buildings it's going to lead to investment in certain areas to do with heritage value as well as to do with cost per metre squared, because capital cost is linked into all this as well. Again, similar story here in terms of demand reduction. And we also looked at a series of tables and profiles around annual operational costs over 30 years, current capital costs, which are now 30% or 40% out of date because they were done eight months ago. But, even just installing a heat pump only was looking at, 630 pence per metre squared at that point for that building, 320 metre squared building. And as we came down to fully certified EnerFit, we were looking at less than 3,000 pence per metre squared, which interestingly sits below the new school building metric for Scottish Futures Trust funding, again, which Sarah referred to earlier. So we were validating as well that actually the cost of deep retrofit is less than the cost of a new build school. And again, just parameters in terms of what their criteria and risk was aligned with as well. We talked a bit about National Grid. Obviously, there's other issues to do with network impact and putting a lot of this on a Passivhaus Trust. Have done studies on this around putting a lot of extra kVA and load on the national grid. And if the local grid's at capacity, really we have responsibility to try and address that. The other really important part of this is, we can go off as experts and people passionate about this and create lots of modelling scenarios and create all of the enabling information to hopefully lead to policy change. But there's clients out there that are actually really willing to make change themselves. And how do we tap into those clients? So how do we tap into a client's decision-making process? And we met with Edinburgh Council once a week for an hour every week for 14 months. Apart from Christmas, where they actually were on the journey with us with this study. And it was a really, really interesting way of trying to develop with significant scope creep, as you can imagine as well, but really interesting way of developing a study around how these priorities sit in a client's mind, especially a multi-bodied client like a local authority. So, operational capital costs, the heritage impacts, and actually where they might be a bit more lenient around heritage, and operational embodied and whole life carbon, well-being and health post-viral COVID world. That was a massive area to take up as well, and how to kind of quantify and visualize those outcomes. Okay, so we went through a series of assessments to try and work out how they could create those outcomes, and a total performance index we were able to establish with them around their main brief criteria that were really important to them, weighted and put against the various factors like cost, carbon, health and well-being, and heritage value, so that they could extrapolate that to their estate as a kind of an initial benchmark for trying to make these significant decisions to do with energy and where they invest their money. So we've continued on the series of 10 buildings that are part of the study, and we worked with Curry and Brown alongside as well to look at cost analysis, and they've extracted the cost analysis to actually complete hypothetically the retrofit for these 300 buildings over the next 10 years. Because Edinburgh have worked that out, they can actually do that if they have 6 providers of kind of deep retrofit experience, rolling out 1 school a year. I don't know how those providers will cope with that, but over a 10-year period on their framework, they could just about manage to do it. And it was interesting to look at like the Letty basic option versus the almost ACB retrofit option versus kind of trying our best to get to retrofit. That we had kind of a 61% improvement overall, and you can see that varies according to building type. So the building characteristics and non-domestic design is so significant on the energy measures that we can do that we have to look at it from a boundary and energy point of view beyond the building. And none of this study looked at offsetting. So we looked at future emission factors. So we didn't look at the 2050 carbon factor. We took a profile between now and 2032 from the BEIS emission factors and projected a little bit of that support through changing from a heat pump, but not relying 100% on it, because we have to be pragmatic that we need to combine the two into kind of a blended option. So 3 of those buildings are now instructed to go forward to be either ENERFIT or just under ENERFIT, so the AUCB retrofit standard, which is really amazing. And the other 9 are likely to go out onto a framework to get delivered by others. Just an example of a completed building, then just to wrap off. So the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership is just going through commissioning at the minute. Gwilym will probably tell me more about that and on the delivery side right now. But just briefly to touch on where we got to with that in terms of a really ambitious client, that we need to start supporting these clients and enabling them to be able to make some of these decisions to go for these types of building delivery. Where the target that was set in terms of ENERFIT Classic was so significant compared to where the measured meter data was in this building. It was an 88% reduction. There was lots of complexity in the building. It was an internally retrofitted project, and the dormers were an absolute nightmare to detail, and there was various other significant lessons learned at that scheme as well. But more importantly, just to talk about the heritage impact to wrap up, where we were actually able to consult and successfully convince planners to go for how can we make heritage buildings of the past and current, fit for purpose for the next 100 years. And actually, maybe this is not appropriate for the next 100 years if we're actually really considering true carbon reduction. And actually, it bettered our heat demand and created better daylight factor. And again, the jury's out whether you think that has significantly harmed the look of the building, but the proportions and the kind of dialogue is the same. And actually, at some point in the past, those window sashes were probably painted black. So there was a solid void legacy at some point for this building in the past also, rather than just the kind of white timbered sashes. So again, we proved and went through a lot of technical data with the planners to get them to support this, which they did, which was fantastic. And actually, this data shows a whole life carbon profile of 100 years, where this is actually on 2018 carbon emission figures, when electricity was still a bit dirtier than gas, as far as I can recall from Wendy. So we're looking at, an 82% whole life carbon emission reduction for that building. So in summary, it's really useful to underpin studies like this with Passivhaus and ENERFIT, the ENERFIT approach. We need to be looking at accurately calculating consumption. So especially in the non-domestic sector, there's been so much work done in the domestic sector. We need to focus on how we can look at this, especially along with local authority clients. We want to create a no regrets approach. So addressing the fabric has to be possible and has to be applied in all of these scenarios. And there's various infrastructural impacts beyond the building boundary if we don't do that. And it's about getting clients to understand that and enabling, us to be able to create and enhance comfort in these buildings as well. And I think that's just really important. Regardless of the heating technology deployed, we need to be able to create buildings that become an enhanced sustainable asset at source, rather than, even though we have in this study relied a little bit on the decarbonisation of the grid, we need to be able to prove that the buildings can withstand that, any trends that come out of this. And also just that idea around, we just look at heat pumps, so there's other exciting things out there like phase change materials, and the study's ongoing really to now update it to current carbon emission factors and current costs of energy and construction costs. There you go. Sorry.
Fantastic. If the two speakers and Andy wouldn't mind joining me, and then if Andy can back on the screen. The conclusion I've reached from those presentations, guys, that was just so fascinating from all three. We can't do this in a quick debate, can we, for that topic? That's so tricky. And the modelling that's going on, it's just fantastic to see the detail that people are going into as to how we work this out. Anyway, we are going to try and run it as a Q&A now. I'm going to take, again, chair's privilege. We're going to finish at 4:40, not 4:30, so we've got time for more questions. So has anyone in the room got a question to begin with? Okay, could we have a microphone to this lady here? And do you mind telling us who you are and where you're from to begin with?
Lizzie Westmacott from ECD Architects. So as a practice, we're doing retrofitting thousands of homes, of which many are social housing decarbonisation funded, which means the heat demand needs to be less than 90 kilowatt hours per metre square per year. I have qualms about this kind of slightly rubbish retrofit, but at the same time, that's where the money is. Question is, should we be doing that?
Who would like to take? Chris, you've got your hand up.
It's interesting that the feedback from the pilot and wave one was the energy target they were meeting was not equivalent to EPC-C, but equivalent to EPC-D. So there are some fundamental issues with EPCs, as we know. I think what we're trying to do at Letty is say that the bigger picture means that that isn't good enough. even EPCC or whatever they think it means isn't good enough. And we're trying to put the case at the high level and then at the low level, at the bottom up, say that we can actually, as an industry, do it better than we're doing it at the moment. So this is dual-pronged. It isn't just government, industry saying to government, you've got to change ground rules. It's the industry saying we need to work in a different way as well.
Anybody else like to come in on this, Andy or Anne-Marie?
I think Andy, you know, if someone's going to set a target like that, Andy's, you know, the AACB approach is something that should be locked in so that you're not stranding assets later on with that approach. And I think, and I'm familiar with the scheme and I applaud that client's ambition at a top level, but obviously in the granular, it might not be coming out that way. That we're very aware of trying to prove that performance is dealing with fuel poverty, because, you know, will that performance actually deal with fuel poverty? When you look at proper Stern report financial forecasting, where electricity costs are going to go up, they're not going to go down, as I think Chris pointed out earlier on, and that's the argument that needs to be made for that client. I feel.
I think
I would.
Okay. Can I just applaud your pejorative question? Slightly rubbish retrofit. I quite like that. Andy, do you want to come in on this?
I just think that one thing we do need to remember is the sort of, in social housing, is the tenants. You know, this is a question of the performance gap, because whether it's a step 1 or step 2, we still need to reduce the performance gap. Otherwise, who pays the bills? You know, it's that expectation management. So, I think it's interesting this change to 90 kilowatt hours per square meter in a year, because it needn't be a poor standard, but the question is, are they staying on gas? Are they moving to a heat pump? You know, if they're moving to a heat pump, somebody needs to champion you know, making sure those costs are explicit so the tenants understand what they will be paying. And I think there's a weak feedback mechanism at the moment after retrofit where I'm not sure there is much of a feedback mechanism. You know, do these buildings perform as intended? Are the bills anywhere near as intended? I mean, that's a question to the audience, really. I'm not aware there are strong feedback mechanisms.
So there's a very strong argument, isn't it, about the kind of the broader interest, apart from your zero carbon targets, but also your cost targets and your comfort targets, and how those get addressed in these different models as well. Laura, is there a question online?
Yep.
Is Laura there? I'll come back to the room straight after I've done the online. I'll come to this side next.
We have a question on sequencing from Gavin Johnston. If installing a heat pump before deep or full fabric retrofit, does this not mean the heat pump system is oversized for the load of the property? And at scale, is this perhaps something that could be moved to another more suitable property and new heat pump installed if required after full retrofit is complete?
Who would like to take that?
I think I'll just mention, Sorry.
I think there's a decarbonisation issue where you can reduce emissions by 70, 80, 85%, depending on what carbon emissions factors you're looking at. And you want to be able to have a plan. Yeah, if there's a phase 2 plan, but again, who takes responsibility for that supply chain to create a circular economy for a product that could move to a bigger building? There's kind of bigger questions to feed into that. And yeah, we looked at that too. You know, what if we just do heat pump first? What if we just do the fabric and leave it on gas for a while? There was lots of debate around various different ways we could approach this. And if some buildings can't get touched for 8 years, well, do we just put the heat pumps in on those now and we retrofit them in 8 years' time when they finally get to site in the procurement process? Because that's the other thing that we're not even touching, is how we procure and the time that it takes to get these buildings to physically site with the phasing and everything else. So in short, yes, it would be good that if the circular economy could click in a bit, I think, on the services at scale.
It seems very relevant to your step 1 and step 2 approach. Do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm getting a lot of feedback. I'm not quite sure whether maybe somebody could turn their microphone off. Alan Clark is sitting, I think, and he's one of the people who've been particularly exercised by this when we've been doing the modelling. But and what it comes down to is making sure that the whole process of designing and installing a heat pump, you know, is as tight and rigorous as it can be, so they're not oversized. But even with the minimal measures we're we're proposing for step one or expecting with step one, it seemed there's nothing theoretically in the way of making a comfortable house with a, you know, reaching performance factors of 200, 350, 400% with good attention to, you know, radiator sizing and all the rest of it. So, you know, so I think the question was, will this approach mean heat pumps are oversized and therefore become inefficient because they're constantly turning on and off? And the experience of the Irish, Tipperary Energy Agency, particular, you know, who have now moved on to be advised to the Irish government for their heat pump program, for their retrofit program, seems to back this up as well. I don't know whether Alan is able to comment, but yeah.
I think in reality, the heat pump design, from even just what we've learned in the last 2 years, and Alan's more expert in this than me, of course, but there is an oversizing issue, and there is a kind of a system inefficiency that's getting built in. So whilst we might be aware of this and want to really implement efficient design, the actual industry isn't giving us the solutions for really efficient heat pump design. And I'm not an M&E engineer, but I do think that's where the risk is.
I'd reinforce that. What we found was, yes, the heat pumps are oversized. The MCS method, which they have to comply with, inbuilt, has problems. But we did find this beautiful cost point where if you don't have to touch the existing heating emitter system or the pipes, and you're only replacing the central kit, and that needs a certain level of building fabric first, you end up with a very interesting cost point, which reduces the cost of your heat pump installation and allows you that good first step, basic first step. You know, and the industry isn't geared up to be able to provide that kind of optimization yet.
So interesting, isn't it? And avoids the 77 radiators problem that Anne-Marie mentioned.
The other thing just to mention is that the COP being monitored in real terms, like we're not getting 3.5 and 3.8, we're getting 2.2. We're getting terrible COP performances in the UK, and that's what we should be modelling, not these higher performances, because the industry is not producing them.
I'm going to come to a new question over on this side. So there's William first. William, yeah. Sorry, waiting for the mic.
Hi, Gwilym Still from Maxford. And I suppose a very quick one on the heat pump side of things. I think for larger systems, it's more amenable to designing for the retrofit because you probably want a couple of heat pumps in there to give you some resilience. And so you can design at the start knowing what the peak load is going to end up being in the future. And at a resi scale, a lot of the time, you can't get a small enough heat pump anyway to start with. So it's not necessarily... Yeah. I guess I had a question probably both for Andy and Chris, which was the standards sound very interesting. Are they being developed with a view to being something which you can contractually specify as a performance requirement? Because that's one of the nice bits with Passivhaus, at least there's a clear route through and it makes it easy under a D&B approach to procure it. And are you putting them forward with something that addresses the quality control side of things during delivery and handover, or as a set of targets and an approach, but with people to figure out their own QA process?
Can I go to Andy first on that one?
Yeah, I think probably Letty might have and the ACB maybe slightly two different approaches. I'm not sure. So our approach is yes, it's something that could be specified in a contract. If all parties were happy with the type of accreditation, so it's self-certification. I don't know if you've looked at the self-certification for the ACB new build standard, but it's not as onerous as third-party certification for Passivhaus, but it does involve putting partly in the public domain and partly in the private domain on the database evidence, which is drawings. It'll be photographic evidence of as built, and at the moment we have a sort of a policy where we will do some checking of what's on there. You know, a certain percentage of projects self-certified are sort of, you know, looked over just to see whether the quality of the information is sufficient. What we're not doing is pulling out things where there's obvious faults that photographs show up. So it's a sort of it's a halfway house. It's better than building regs, but it's not as rigorous as Passivhaus certification. But we think it's a sort of probably a viable and scalable system for certifying, and it has an element of quality assurance about it for sure. Yeah.
We would like to have a standard specification that could be applied. We're not the kind of organisation which could implement and oversee that. What we want to do is show what is possible, open eyes to what is possible at government level and industry level, and say where the products need to be developed. The idea of then being able to specify that kind of level will probably remain at the same kind of level it is at the moment for the Climate Emergency Design Guide. We're planning policy, giving that as a clear steer. We are, just as one final point, contemplating saying the target ought to be different if you do not have the verification in place. In other words, and this isn't, I don't like the terms, instead of going for EPC B+, though we won't be quoting that, you'll probably need to go for A+ if you actually want to try and get to that level. You know, it's trying to put over clearly that EPCs are lousy, and two, the industry needs to get its act together and clients on making sure the verification is put in place.
Very important questions about verification. I'm going to take another question online, if you don't mind, Laura.
Thank you. Just to mention also that online we've got some interesting conversations going on in the chat, and we also have our remote panelists typing answers to questions. So we will select some highlights and circulate them to delegates after the event. A couple of questions on MVHR, which I might roll into one. From Chika Igwe, she asks, how does MVHR work with radon emission mitigation? Can it increase emission levels by negative pressure if occasionally turned off when the building is unoccupied? And then another question on MVHR from Maria Valkova, directed to Chris, but I'm sure anyone can answer it. Can you tell us more about the cost and energy performance comparison between MVHR and demand-controlled MEV in domestic retrofits? And is there any way we can read more about your findings?
So direct to you, Chris, do you want to start?
I'm not sure I can comment particularly on the first question, looking at radium. So I'm going to focus on the second. In cost terms, the MVHR is a second order issue in the UK stock because of the way we operate them at temperatures which are not constant at the moment. Yeah, if the temperatures in our dwellings rise, it becomes more appropriate. We may get there, and therefore it's easier to justify MVHR. What we have found, though, is because it's a second order issue, we can reduce the efficiency of the MVHR, but we do gain on the moisture side. So we're potentially able to relax that 0.75 factor for thermal bridging because we're getting a more reliable, lower humidity level. So it helps us on the fabric level, which demand extract doesn't give us, for example. But I'll leave it there. I'd love to get into the nitty gritty, but I think that's probably over a pint somewhere, even if it's a virtual pint.
Anne-Marie or Andy, do you want to come in with this?
I can give it a go. I mean, first of all, if there's a high concentration of radon, that will have been identified, and there'll be mitigation even for a retrofit in place for that. So I think there needs to be, you know, you're not just going to retrofit a building that's emitting really high levels of radon. In relation to schools, you know, we are looking at, well, the MVHRs would be turned off in summer when they're not in use, you know, in terms of looking at a usage pattern over the year. And I think if that was identified, it would be similar to the study that we've done at UCL on particulates and off-gassing in Passivhaus schools, where radon slightly wasn't in that study, but what we were inferring was that there's still provision to ventilate that building or leave an MVHR on during, you know, leave an MVHR on a kind of bypass mode. So you're relying a little bit more passively on it. And you're also, the additional air tightness isn't a risk in relation to, you know, who levels of harm basically for many particulates, because that is a concern. You know, if you make buildings airtight and the MVHR doesn't work, what happens? But yeah, I mean, I think the radon issue is almost separate to how you then mechanically service the building. That would need to be dealt with as part of the kind of deep dive forensic assessment of the building. I don't know if anyone, an M&E expert might, like Willem might have a comment on that, or Andy, but. Andy, do you want to comment on this one?
Yeah, I'm not an M&E expert at all. I defer to others, but we're very relaxed these days about MVHR going into buildings that only, for example, achieve an air permeability of 5. We still think there are some advantages. So bungalows, for example, do offer opportunities to run ductwork under the insulation in the attic ceiling area. So certainly MVHR could be more viable than maybe we previously thought about it. In terms of radon, I think it is an issue, and there have been some surveys done of passive house buildings. There have been some surveys in Ireland again, which have suggested that actually the radon problem is slightly worse than previously thought. But I think you need to think about the physical barriers at source, which Anne-Marie just talked about. So if you're keeping a suspended floor in place, then you've got a natural, as long as there's cross ventilation under the floor, and you've made some effort to seal the floor. It might have a carpet. You might seal the edge of the floor over time, rather than have ventilation air tracking up right through your house. That takes it out at source. If you replace the suspended floor with a solid floor, and you've identified there's a radon issue, there are some partial measures you can take, basic measures, or even more robust measures with sumps and so on, which gets a bit expensive. So the things you can do without having to rely on the ventilation system is I think what I'm saying. I think there's a longer debate about types of ventilation in retrofit, which probably could warrant a good technical webinar or something. I think we need to sort of get to grips with it a bit, particularly whether what looks like what's going to become the mainstream retrofit ventilation mode, which is decentralized MEV, so individual continuous running, but in a wet room based ventilation extracts. Does that give sufficient indoor air quality? I think that's probably going to be where the industry is going to go almost entirely. But will it do the job?
On that final point, we've identified a worst case where someone's drying clothes in the spare bedroom, where the demand mechanical extract does not address it, period. And yet that is where we're seeing evidence of condensation.
Okay, so I actually think that's a really good place to stop, and I know it isn't, in that that's a really detailed technical point of how we're going to address that. But actually, what this session said to me is, this is really exciting, interesting modelling that we're trying to work out our position on this place, not just about Passivhaus, but just generally. How are we approaching these different buildings in different timescales for different purposes, to achieve different outcomes. So I think we need to have much more detailed investigations of those through the Passivhaus Trust and others, and I think we will have to commit to do that going forward. Not just how do you deliver Passivhaus retrofit, but this question of how far, how deep, at what cost to achieve what outcomes. I think we need to do much more in exploring that for different building types. Absolutely, Margaret. So I think we need to do that. And actually, we've got 3 questions, and I now don't like any of the 3 questions after these presentations. So I don't think any of them work, but we're going to put them up anyway. And I'm going to make a slight adjustment for the first one. I'm going to make a slight adjustment for all of them. So these are the questions. Should we adopt operational net zero carbon targets for all existing buildings? And I'm using the LETI net zero carbon definition for operation. Operational net zero is LETI definition. Do people know that definition? It was on a slide, but we seem to have lost that slide. Anyway, it doesn't allow for offsetting. It allows you to have on-site or off-site renewables that are directly relevant to that site, directly allocated to that site, but no offsetting of your carbon emissions to, say, tree planting in Africa, say. So that's what it allows for. Second question then, should we adopt targets? And the word shallow is the problem here, isn't it? So should we adopt targets associated with a shallow retrofit plus a heat pump approach? I'm going to take off air source and just say it's just a heat pump approach plus shallow retrofit. What does shallow mean? That's why I don't like it. And then finally, should Passivhaus Enefit be set as a target where feasible? So should we aim for that for all the broader benefits where that is feasible? But the problem is the word feasible, isn't it? So anyway, we're going to vote on them because it's a summer event. It's just a bit of fun. And then we're going to go and argue about it over drinks. So question 1, operational net zero carbon targets for, last clarification. I'm going to allow you to say nearly all. And the exemption I'm going to allow you to make is for, say, protected heritage buildings. So nearly all existing buildings. So accepting those, and we might argue that they should be in, but exempting those for the moment, that's the wording I'm going to go for, nearly all. So those people who say yes to that question, should we, operational net zero for nearly all existing buildings? Yeses, please put your hand up. Okay, I think that is 50 to 60%. And again, we've got a complete split between the halves of the room. Okay, so 60% yes. Who's no? Okay, only 2 no's. Okay, that's interesting. And don't know. Yeah, no, I agree. Just to keep your hands up for don't know. Okay, so that's about 15 people. So that's 20%, Laura. What have you got online, Laura?
Well, it's maybe a bit more balanced online. 27% say no, bit over half say yes, and 21% undecided.
I think that's very similar to the numbers we've got in the room, actually, but you can see the problem with the questions, actually, until we've got much more knowledge and specificity in the question. It's very tricky. Question 2, should we adopt targets associated with a shallow retrofit and a heat pump approach? So people who are yes for that. Yes for shallow retrofit. Okay, we've got about 20 people in the room. No? How many people are no? Okay, again, we've got 2. And don't know. I'm in the don't know camp as well, actually, guys, so yeah. Okay, again, we've got 25, I would say, in the don't know. Laura, what have we got online?
We've got 32% in the don't know, 27% in the no, but yes is just winning at 43%.
Okay, so slightly more yeses in the room, but still fairly balanced across those questions. And then the last one, should Passivhaus Enefit be set as the target where feasible? Yes. I know exactly that. I just can't. Okay, we've got about 65 people in the room. No votes? Nobody's a no. How can you when it's feasible? It's duh. Okay, and don't know. Who doesn't know? Okay, 4 people said don't know, but actually that would be within feasible anyway. So, and that's a perfect place to leave it. What we're going to do now, before we finish, can I just ask to say thank you to the panelists again for their contributions. And I was struggling to work out how to keep people within time, but actually now I understand why now, because it's such a complex thing to try and explain and get some kind of mapping on that. It's you did incredibly well, guys, all of you. That's been really most informative and interesting. We've got drinks next door in the garden room. If anyone would like to stay with us, we're going to be here till about 5:30. And after 5:30, we've also got booked a pub nearby called The Fence. We've got outdoor seating, so it's as safe as we can be. You're very welcome to come and join us at that as well. We'll probably be there till about 9-ish. William may be there a little bit longer. But yeah, please do join us for drinks next door and for the pub afterwards. And thank you very much for everybody for joining us. And thank you online people as well.